Hey everyone, it is late at night and I am Norman. There are all kinds of watch complications out there. Some of them are useful, some of them are just kind of pretty to look at, but not so useful. I've got a list of just a few of the complications that are out there. Tonight we're going to go down this list. I'll share with you my opinions of each one, and we'll look at some examples of each complication. So let us begin. Alright, the first complication I have on my list is the date window. Most of you already know what I think of date windows. I am not a fan. I realize that date windows are important for a lot of watch collectors out there, so bear in mind that this is just my opinion on watches that I would add to my personal collection. But I personally find that date complications are fairly unnecessary. It's not terribly often that I need to know what date it is. And if I do, I can simply ask somebody or look at my phone. I feel like most of the time, date complications look like an afterthought, and they kind of ruin the design of the dial. Of course, there are exceptions to everything, and there are some brilliant date windows out there, usually ones that are framed nicely or are just part of the design and don't look like someone forgot about it and at the last minute cut a square in the dial and called it good. The next complication on my list is the day-date complication. And I actually don't mind these as much as just date complications. I feel like because it's a larger element on the dial, it kind of looks more like part of the design. It looks a bit less of an afterthought, at least in my experience. So I actually don't mind a day-date complication as much as just a straight date window, but I still find it kind of unnecessary. Again, if I need to know what day of the week it is for some weird reason, I could look at my phone or ask somebody. Same with the date itself. The next complication on my list is the big date complication. And I actually like big date complications. I feel like when they're done well, usually at the 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock, they just look great on the dials. I don't know why I like them so much. The aesthetics of them just, I feel look great. So if you're gonna have to put a date on your dial, in my opinion, go with the big date. Next up on my list is the annual calendar. And this complication takes the date complication to the next level, so it'll account for days of the month and whatnot. And no, really unnecessary. I feel like this complication is doubly unnecessary. It's bad enough to have a date window, in my opinion, but now you're making it even more complicated just to save me from having to tweak the date every now and then. Yeah. The next complication is the perpetual calendar. Now, don't get me wrong, on a lot of these complications, I appreciate them for their technical genius and sometimes for their aesthetics in general. The perpetual calendar is one such impressive complication, and yet I feel like it's a lot of work. My watches are often sleeping, so a lot of times I have to wake watches up. A perpetual calendar, you would really have to keep it on a winder all the time, especially if it's one of the older ones. Maybe they still do this with newer ones. But I've heard about perpetual calendars that you can't even do a quick set on them. So if you let the watch fall asleep for a few years, you would have to cycle through all of those years to get it caught up. Yeah, that is a pain. And there's just no way that you could really let the watch sleep. It would have to be running constantly. So a perpetual calendar for someone who has a one watch collection might be pretty cool. Or someone who likes watch winders, perhaps, but it's a very impressive complication, very cool. I admire the genius behind it, but I personally would not want to have to deal with that, especially for the price that most of those watches go for. Yeah, no. Next up is the moon phase. And here my opinion might surprise you. I actually like the moon phase complication. I would probably never ever use one, and I'm sure if I had watches that had moon phases on them, it would probably never ever be set correctly. But I think they look great, especially on really dressy pieces. I don't know what it is about a moon phase. I think it just kind of takes the dressy factor to the next level. So I actually like that complication. And next up is the power reserve complication. I actually do not own any watches that have a power reserve. I don't think I've ever owned a watch that has a power reserve, but I really like this complication because, like I mentioned, my watches spend a fair amount of time in the watch box or temporarily on a shelf. And if it's an automatic watch, the one thing that I find frustrating is you never know quite how much power they have in reserve. Whereas a manual wind watch, you wind it up all the way and you know it's full. But if I have an automatic that I'm not really wearing all the time, but I do want to keep running because I will wear it for a little bit here and there, if I could just glance at it and know when I'm going to need to wind it next, that would be pretty handy. That way I'm not usually unscrewing a crown and then winding it. I don't want to be doing that unnecessarily. So I could check the power reserve here and there, and once it's just about to die, I could wake it up a bit more. I feel like that's a pretty cool complication. Some of them look brilliant. I do like the oversized power reserves that are usually at a 12 o'clock position and usually in Bauhausy pieces. Those look amazing. However, I don't need it on the dial. If there's a power reserve in a display case back, I would be totally cool with that. That way it doesn't interrupt the design of the dial. But I think those are a pretty useful complication. So for this next one, I'm pretty sure that I've always been mispronouncing this word in my head. I don't think I've ever actually said it out loud, but this is the sidereal time. I always thought it was sidereal, but I think it's sidereal time. This is time told as though you were an observer in space, and I absolutely love this complication for its nerd factor. I love watching crazy physics videos and whatnot. I love sci-fi and anything space related. So from that perspective, I love this complication. I just don't understand how it would be useful for pretty much anybody though. But it is impressive and definitely nerdy. The next complication on my list is the tourbillon. So, I'm not a huge fan of open heart complications, and a lot of times tourbillons kind of remind me of open heart complications. They have sort of a similar aesthetic. That coupled with the fact that this complication doesn't really help in the accuracy of watches quite like it does with pocket watches. I'm not a huge fan of the tourbillon. I really admire its complexity, and most watches are well beyond my price range forever, but I just don't really care for its aesthetic usually. Sometimes I'll see some pretty crazy tourbillons, but for the most part, yeah, I'm not a huge fan. For the next complication, I've kind of lumped a whole bunch of different similar complications into one, and I'm calling this chimes. So this would be minute repeaters or all the other variants that essentially the watch chimes. I think this is a pretty interesting complication. I've never owned a watch that chimes before. I've seen a few videos, so I've gotten to hear what the different chimes sound like. And in some instances, they're actually done as a design element, and you can see the hammers that are responsible for the chiming. I'm not sure if these would be irritating after a while or not. I think at this point I'm kind of indifferent on these. I would have to experience a watch that has some sort of a chime mechanism, then I would have an opinion on them, but right now I could go either way. I feel like it would be kind of fun to have a watch that makes a noise every now and then, and if it's one of the pieces where you could see the hammers, that would be pretty cool to see those in action, but then again, I don't know if I would get irritated with it after a while. So, I'm not sure on that one. Next up, we have the chronograph. And up until recently, I never really even thought about chronographs. I didn't have much of an interest in getting chronograph watches, but now that's a little bit different. I own a few chronographs. I've used them a couple times, but in general, that complication isn't much use to me personally. I like the aesthetics of chronographs, so I would have to say I'm a fan of the chronograph complication, simply for the aesthetic of the dial, and if you do need a timer, it is kind of handy. And that's what I've used mine for, usually in cooking or making cocktails where I have to shake them for X amount of minutes, like gin fizzes. 5 minutes of non-stop cocktail shaking is no joke. Next up we have the GMT, and this would cover all varieties of GMT. I kind of like the GMT complication. The closest thing I own to an actual GMT would have to be the Serica because it has a GMT bezel, at least. And a couple of my digital watches will allow me to set more than one time, so they're kind of GMTs as well. I like this complication because I love vacationing and I would like to do a lot more of it. And if I do start vacationing a lot more, it would be kind of handy to have a GMT so I can quickly flip it over to the time zone that I'm going to. So I think at some point it would be good to get a traveler's GMT. But yes, I'm actually a fan of this complication. The last complication on my list is a very interesting one, and this is the deadbeat seconds complication. You'll often hear mechanical watch lovers talk about the beautiful sweep of a mechanical seconds hand versus the horrible, jarring ticking of a quartz hand. The interesting thing about this complication is it takes a mechanical watch and makes its seconds hand act like it's a quartz watch. So it ticks once per second. The idea behind this is for medical purposes, doing blood pressure and whatnot. And strangely enough with this complication, I'm a little bit indifferent about it. I personally would rather have a sweeping seconds hand on a mechanical watch. And even on quartz pieces, I can live with the ticking seconds hand, but usually I would just prefer them to be two-handers. So this is a very odd complication, and I would have to say that I'm not a huge fan of it, especially with the advent of quartz. If you do need deadbeat seconds, you could just go with a quartz watch. There are fancy quartz watches out there, so if you wanted something luxurious, you could get a luxury quartz watch. So yeah, deadbeat seconds, not a huge fan of them. So there you have it, just a small sampling of watch complications that are out there, and my opinions of each of them. Thanks for watching.